Come, imagine with us.
Can and may we, in present-day Berlin, imagine a Middle East unified in peace and equality?
Across national borders and religious and lingual divisions.
With literature, discourse, and music.
Cinema, performance, poetry, special feminist and queer discussions.
The 4-day Middle East Union Festival, with guests from all over the world, makes this vision seem within reach and invites you to freely explore ideas of utopia.
Come, imagine with us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for connecting to the panel, Writing the Arab Jew Reflection on Displacement and Middle Eastern Diasporas, as part of the MEU, the Middle East Union Festival that's happening here in the Literarisch Kollegium in Berlin. I'm very flattered and honored and proud to have these two great scholars today with us to talk about the dislocation from the Middle East and their impacts on identity, including within the European and American context. Today we have Georges Khalil, the academic coordinator of the Berlin-based forum, Trans-Regional Studying and its research program Europe in the Middle East in Europe, YUMI, that seeks to rethink key concepts and premises that link and divide Europe and the Middle East. Georges Khalil will moderate today the panel. And today, really, we have Professor Ella Shohat, a professor of cultural studies and Middle Eastern studies at the New York University. She has been writing about the Middle Eastern and Arab Jews since the 80s. Her books include the just published Colonialité et Repetures, écrites sur les figures juives arabes, Julie Marily Taldo, translation by J. Marley Lux Editor, 2021, on the Arab Jew and Palestine and other displacements, selected writing Pluto 2017, recipient of the 2017 Middle Eastern Monitor Palestine Book Award. She has a lot of other publications, as well as Georges Khalil has other publications. I just read part of their biographies. We are very, very happy to have you both of you here today. Before we start, I just want to say, please do not photograph or take videos of this conversation. We would like to keep it off the social media and other social media, other YouTube and so on. And please, you can ask questions at all the time if you connect to the Facebook event of this panel. Again, I'll tell you the name so you can find it on Facebook. Writing the Arab Jew Reflection on Diaspora on Displacements and Middle Eastern Diasporas. And you will ask questions. We will take the question at the last third of the conversation, and we will give it to Georges and Ella, and they will address the different questions by your name. And yeah, so I'm very, very happy. I think the question of the Arab Jew and displacement is part of the MEU idea, because we cannot go forward without talking about history, and I think the body of the research of the Arab Jew is one good point to talk about how we reimagining the place of minorities and so forth in the Middle East. But I will give the scholars to talk about it, which it's the It's their research for all this time, and they have the knowledge and the wisdom. Thank you, Georges Khalil and Professor Ella Shohat from New York. Georges Khalil is here in Berlin. Thank you very much for joining us, and the stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction and also for the initiative. It's a nice opportunity for me to have a conversation with Ella, even though I find it a bit strange to do it via Zoom. I'm sitting here in the Wallotstraße, where you lived the last 10 months, but we didn't meet due to the pandemic regulations. I have the feeling I know you all my professional life. I started working here at the Wissenschaftskolleg or in the Wallotstraße now for the Forum Transregionale Studien. I started working here 25 years ago, and I think I know you since then. But actually, if I remember right, we only met 3 times. The first time, maybe 15 years ago, in the flat of Yola Shafiq, with Sergio Costa and your husband. And then for 2 conferences. One on the possibilities of Arab Jewish thought 7 years ago with Ilyas Huri and lots of other friends. And then in the Jewish Museum on the conference, I think it was called Jews in Muslim Societies. But your name and your work always came up in conversations with many of our fellows. Some of you who know and are common friends, like Sinan Antoun, for example. I remember that with Sinan, we had also a friendly dispute. He insisted not only that Iraqi food is better than Egyptian food, which may be true. I wouldn't tell him personally. I wouldn't acknowledge that, but it's certainly true. But he also said that the Iraqi Jewish history is a very special and particular experience, an idea which I contested because, in a way, I think also the Egyptian experience or the experience of Egyptian Jew and their history in the country is also very special. Maybe we will talk about some of these points later. I think my first question would go back to your idea or to the moment or the time when you formulated for the first time your ideas and thoughts about the Arab Jew. I think, if I'm not indiscreet, you were born in Israel. I read also by other Iraqi or Jews who came from Iraq, like Sassoon Samek, for example. I think he even claimed he's the last Arab Jew. So what was for you the idea of an Arab Jew in the 80s? What did you mean with that? Whom did you address? Which issues? So maybe you can talk about the past in the beginning.
Well, first, thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this event. And like George, I terribly regret that this event is via Zoom and that George and I were neighbors and yet were unable to see each other, but this is a pandemic world. So I'm at least delighted that we are able to compensate for that through Zoom and through technology with all its difficulties and obstacles. But I think it's also perhaps a kind of a metaphor for our situation. We'll begin perhaps even before with the Arab Jew, the fact that we are located at different sites brought together. And that actually often makes me think about communication technologies, what it meant for people dislocated, displaced from the Middle East, specifically Jews from Arab countries. We'll come soon to the term Arab Jew. But in the wake, especially of the partition of Palestine and the establishment of Israel, we tend to forget how traumatic it was precisely because we did not have this possibility, even on the very mundane, literal level, of communicating with our neighbors, the people who were left behind, even relatives who were left behind, Jews who ended up in Israel. Were not able to communicate with the few relatives who remained in Iraq, for example. There were still a community of, say, about 20,000 estimated. Communication through letters was impossible because any letter from Israel to Iraq would be immediately identified, confiscated, and people could go to prison. Of course, telephone at the time, forget about it. People lived in tents in Israel. Passports, of course, people could not travel for financial reasons, let alone even getting a passport. Even it was a fanciful idea to even travel. And the reason why I want to start with this communication technologies, I mean, I did not think that I would start that way, but the moment that George touched, and Mati, you touched on the idea of being in different places, it immediately, and George asked me to speak about the past, it threw me to a moment even prior to me being born. But also it continued into the 60s and 70s. So I think for, say, Middle Eastern diasporas who were dislocated, say, to the West, to Europe and the Americas, it was slightly a different situation than for those Middle Eastern Jews dislocated to Israel. And the reason, of course, having to do with the fatal separation that was taking place between Jews and Arabs. It was impossible to cross the border. So, and then on top of it, you mentioned Sasson Somech, and many of the Arab specialists were recruited for participating in now the state security apparatus. So the Arabic-speaking Jews could exist in Israel as Arabic speakers as part of the apparatus of the state. However, as cultural practices in the public sphere, that was completely taboo. So the way I grew up living, I spoke at home Arabic, that was the language we spoke at home, in the Iraqi, Baghdadi Jewish dialect, as we did in the community, as we did in the synagogue, in the neighborhoods. In a sense, I grew up in Israel in a town called Petah Tikva, which was dominated by Iraqi Jews, the marketplace, the synagogue, etc. So it felt like, and you mentioned Sinan, actually one of the first pieces that I wrote when Sinan invited me to contribute to one, he was a co-founder of Jadaliyah, was actually Remember a Baghdad Elsewhere. And I remember that when I received the copy edited version of the essay, it was Remembering Baghdad Elsewhere. I said, no, the article A is missing. It's not about me remembering Baghdad simply. It's about Petah Tikva now becoming a Baghdad elsewhere, and how Baghdad has been translated into Israel. And that's how my memory of Baghdad, why would I know the streets? And sometimes when I talk to Palestinians, it became a kind of a weird kind of mirror image of a generation. People like myself who did not live in Iraq and yet felt as though we were living Iraq. And that has to do with how when you have massive exodus of people, not simply one family immigrating or a few families immigrate, but this kind of massive dislocation that takes place, not necessarily by choice. We'll come back to that point. What you have is a transplant of cultural practices, despite the new situation. And I think for me to begin to speak about my intellectual work of the 80s, as I was coming of age as a young scholar, I have to begin to speak about my own formation within that community. And I think it's important to do so because there is a tendency, especially the field of Middle East studies, I still believe is still formed in very conventional ways that hasn't undertaken the kind of almost revolutionary theoretical formation, say, in the field of American studies. In the sense that, or in feminist studies or in gender studies, where the biographical elements of the scholar do come to play a role in the way we think about our methods, our way we conceptualize those narratives. So this idea of the body of the scholar, as it were, the experiences of the scholars do not matter because scholarship is just an objective field. That's okay, of the Wissenschaft, has to be come into question. And therefore, when you began, when you asked me about the 80s, I wanted to start even earlier, because there is the formation of the young person that bled into my early writing, because I was not actually formed in Middle East studies. And I'm really a cultural studies person who took on to write about Jewish and Middle Eastern themes within this formation. I hope I'm answering your question, at least.
Yeah, in some ways. No, I thought, well, I don't know. I thought, for example, the difference between your position or your ideas about the Arab Jew at that time and those articulated by persons like Sassoon Sommer. At the time, perhaps, when Jewish life in most of the Arab lands has shrunk to very tiny communities, or taken different trajectories. We can also talk about that later. So I thought maybe the difference might be that your idea of the Arab Jew at that time was a political idea. That was
not only no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I would, first of all, I don't separate, I call it the cultural politics of a concept, the cultural politics of analysis. So culture and politics are not two separate realms. But since you're mentioning Sassoon Sommer did not define himself as an Arab Jew. In fact, it was part of our conversation in New York in the late 90s that impacted him. And in fact, I was pressuring him. I said, well, when we actually even talked about the possibility of having a project together interviewing Iraqis. So in fact, Sassoon Sommer was not part, it's very interesting to speak about the generational difference. He was a scholar of Arabic literature. He was not engaged in his own identity and was not actually participating in any of the Mizrahi activities and part of our history, in contrast to Sami Michael, for example. Sami Michael is a novelist who wrote an amazing novel that was published in the 70s. Some are more equal than others, actually participated in this kind of shaping of a different alternative consciousness. But it's not true of Sassoon Sommer. So I think once, and for him to define the last Arab Jew, I take an issue with it, because I think what it did, in fact, I can even tell you, it goes back to, for example, we were part of a conference in Sweden. That's where I met first Sassoon Sommer, not part of the Mizrahi activism, but post-Oslo, the Swedish Cultural Institute organized a big conference between, on literature and cinema between Palestinians and Israelis. And Sassoon Sommer was part of that Israeli delegation. In fact, just to be honest, it was the Palestinians who pushed for my presence there. I was the scholar who wrote, after all, a book on Israeli cinema. And Sassoon and I were the only two Iraqis there. You know, mostly it was Palestinian and Ashkenazi Jews. And when Sobol, for example, spoke about the disappearance of Yiddish, I kind of stood up and said, in our dialect, in our Iraqi dialect, and before that I told Sassoon, will you join me? Because he's erasing the fact that Jews spoke Arabic. Sassoon did not join me. Now, why am I telling this story? Sassoon spoke about Naguib Mahfouz, about Arabic literature. I spoke about Arab Jews. Now, it's interesting because I'm younger than him, right? But Sassoon was also invited to the Toledo meeting, which was, I write about it in my work, the famous Toledo meeting, which was between Arab Jewish intellectuals, Sephardic intellectuals, and Palestinian, and that was organized in Toledo, precisely the symbolic site of translation 1989, to break the silence or the law that forbade from Israelis to meet with Palestinians. He was invited, he decided not to join that. So the reason why I'm telling is a very knowledgeable person who enjoyed and was friendly with Sassoon, is that I think that story of the Arab Jew cannot be told chronologically. And I think that's interesting. Why is it that it's not that people of his generation did not identify themselves as Arab Jews? For example, Shimon Balas did. We also had a journal based in Paris called Perspective Judéo-Arabe, which was founded in the 80s and was part of that organization of the Toledo meeting. So the term Arab Jew existed. It was in circulation. We did not invent it. But was interesting, at least in my work, I tried to theorize it and give it a certain kind of a cultural political meaning. Now I'm coming back to the question that it's not simply political, because the politics of culture is central to our argument, because our culture was taboo. Hence, one of the title of my books is Taboo Memories, Diasporic Voices, because it was taboo. And that's, I come back to the fact that you could, as an Arab Jew, as an Arabic-speaking Jew, you can exercise your Arabic in the security forces, but not in the cultural public sphere. That took a revolution. And I do believe that for people like us to come out and reclaim what was denied to us when Arabic was only, Arabic and being an Arab was only negative in the public sphere, not unlike the way it was in Europe and in the Americas. For a younger generation to come and say, no, I'm an Arab, then the whole wave of attacking and negation starts. And my point is that it's fascinating. As a child, my parents, I would be called Arab as negative. Stinky Iraqi, Arab, etc. But when we start reclaiming the term and say, we are Arabs, we are Arab Jews, then a wave of attack. So what has it in common? Subjectivity. When the oppressed decides to speak on his, her behalf, you deny the agency. So it's okay to be denounced as Arab, but once you say you're an Arab, oh, no, you're not an Arab, you're confusing. Scholars, I'm not just, someone like myself is not simply attacked in the public sphere. Among scholars who would say, oh, the kind of patronizing ideas that somehow we think we're Arab, we don't know that we're not Arabs. It's fascinating, this idea. It's fascinating, this idea when a scholar, an intellectual can claim a part of their identity and when they cannot claim it. So I come back to the question that our culture was rejected, eliminated, hidden. So all the concept that I tried to develop in the 80s, the Arab Jew, not because I invented the term, no, because I gave it a particular meaning that has to do in the context of negation. But also as a hyphenated idea, that suggested that there is no contradiction. Hence my emphasis that those are not mutually exclusive categories. This is not an oxymoronic ideas. Why is it? It's an anomalous concept only in the case of the Jew, but not in the case of the Christian Arab. And there is an insistence on that. With Christian Arabs, it is something completely different because Jews are also a nation. They're ethnicities, almost a racial category. They're not simply just a religion, you know? So the way the Christian Arab, and I think, George, you can comment on that more, we can have like a fun kind of comparative study of the way the construction of the Christian Arab compared to the Jewish Arab that circulates in the public sphere is quite different. And that has to do very much with Palestine. Yeah. So I take an issue with Sasson, who was a dear friend, but I think the way, once he came to claim that identity for himself, he did it to my mind, in a very problematic way, because he denied, in fact, what he did is actually to deny and bury the idea of the Arab Jew. Because he suggested that, first of all, he's not the last one, you know, he met my father. My father was older and also lived in a poorer neighborhood of Tatran, which Sasson, as he told me and told my father, he never visited, right? He lived in the elite neighborhood. And that's you know, where he felt he was more English. Those class differences is also another issue, but I'm saying that when we think about the who can claim the term, I'm afraid that someone like Sasson actually ended up reproducing the hegemonic discourse about the Arab Jew by saying that only people in the past, in a particular point, who spoke Fusha Arabic, not dialectic Arabic, God forbid, mal lahja, bas al-Fusha, and participated in Arabic nationalist discourses, and were part of that notion of modernity. Only they can claim the term Arab Jew. I find it, in fact, in my intro to the Pluto book on the Arab Jew, Palestine, and other displacement, I specifically addressed this point as highly problematic, lack of flexibility and dynamic in understanding any term of identity, let alone the Arab Jew. And that identities are dynamic and always in flux, and so are their definitions.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. I think you're coming back to this dispute with Sinan I mentioned. First I got, of course, interested in questions.
Can you remind me the dispute again? This is about Egyptian versus Iraqi?
Not in a way, it sounds a bit strange, but which countries' Jews are more particular, no? More precious?
They're more
precious in a way, the Iraqi Jews or the Egyptian Jews.
I
approached, of course, I approached my interest in the lives and trajectories of Jews in Arab lands comes also from what you indicated, from my own personal biographical background. It's coming partly from an Egyptian Christian family. But I find, and all the questions that arise from that, also from my own biography, being born in Germany as someone who is German but not quite, who's something else as well, but what exactly is also changing over time. So I thought what I read about the experience of Iraqi Jews, for example, in the formation of the political ideas in the time of independence, they were a bit different from let's say, the Jews of Morocco or Egypt. Egyptian Jews were very prominent in the national movement and also in the communist movement. And they considered, I think, themselves always to be more Egyptian than Arab. As I think Egyptian Christians also consider themselves more Christian, more Egyptian than Arab. Arabness came as a kind of political culture category in the modern sense, I think only in the 20s. And then later in the 50s, it became also a political category with the birth of Arab nationalism on a massive scale. So I understood the experience of Iraqi Jews as maybe comparable to that of, let's say, of some Greek Orthodox thinkers who were part of the formulation of the idea of Arabism. So in a way, they developed the language and the concepts politically and culturally to be part of these things. The second thought, I think, is that, I jump a bit to what I wanted to say at the end, because you said it's related to perhaps the notion of the Arab Jew within the Israeli society, like has been formulated in relation to the context in Palestine and in relation to the polarization of the of history and of property and of access and of rights and so on. So perhaps your parents have been Iraqi Jews, but they became Arab Jews, as a negative description and perhaps as a self-assertion in a particular context that in a way is diasporic. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think today when interaction among people from different Arab countries is very difficult in terms of travel and mobility and so on, especially for maybe for laborers. It's they go from one country to another, or also some academic laborers, but like intellectual natural encounters and networks and so on seem to be fragmented. And national policies focus on the national. So sometimes I half jokingly, half sadly think that Arabness, after the demise of Arab nationalism itself, becomes a diasporic or an exilic category. Maybe it's not true, no? But as an idea, I think it then connects perhaps to your work and thoughts about diaspora and diasporic frameworks that somehow, I think, dissociate the question of the Arab Jew from a direct biological inheritance or so, but links it to a perspective.
Yeah, thank you, George. Yeah, I think there is a lot in what you said. It's very evocative and also requires that we think on one level historically, on another level also theoretically, how we formulate ideas. It becomes almost a reflexive question. So there is the historical question, and I'm not a historian, but historians often pose the question, when was exactly the term Arab used by whom? And then in that context, there is the emphasis on the Arab nationalist movement, always culminating with pan-Arabism as the climax of that idea of the Arab as a unifying category that transcends nation states, the various Arab, Iraqi, Egyptian, Moroccan, etc. Of course, the historical from the fall of the Ottoman Empire to independence movement vis-a-vis British and French colonialism play a role in it. And that is an important part of the discussion which you touched on. And so I'm not in argument with that. I think it is an important part of that history. And vis-a-vis that, yes, of course, the notion of the Arab emerges one as a transcendent of the particularities of being an Iraqi, being an Egyptian, and you know, at certain moments you have more the emphasis on the question of the Arab, especially with the Arab League, right, formation, if we look historically into that question. Then there is the question of the diaspora, as you raise it, which is also interesting for our discussion. Arabness can be seen as also a diasporic term in the sense that it allowed people dislocated at various points from Arab countries arriving en masse because of political upheavals usually to Britain, to France, to Germany, and also to the Americas. And in that context, a Lebanese and an Iraqi and an Egyptian can form on the basis of that shared history, linguistic, cultural practices, etc., a certain kind of affinity and bonding that made sense. Then there is also the question that you raised, which is also important for us, the religious category. I don't think that those categories are mutually exclusive. And for me, it's that important that I think part of the problem, as I see it in the debate, is that we have to choose. You know, you're Copt, you're Christian, therefore you're not Arab. You're a Jew, therefore you're not really an Arab, or you may be an Iraqi Jew, but you're really Babylonian because you were there before the Arabs, etc. So what we get is a constant debate that I find very exhausting and not very intellectually productive, because it's constantly premised on positing categories against each other. When in fact, as we know, even from our more intuitive and experiential existence, that we all form as individual and as communities multitude. And we have affinities that can be both. In this case, we can have an affinity as Arabic speakers or children of Arabic speakers or grandchildren of Arabic speakers, as happened in the US, for example. People claim Arabness even though they do not speak Arabic at all, but they have an affinity with that idea. At the same time, people can have religious affinities because that was part of their formation. They can have also an affinity to that country from which they came, you know, from which they were exiled. They left Iraq because of the Ba'ath, not because they wanted to leave. Or they also have ancient roots, right? And that actually I find fascinating, the way and I'm working on it right now, the question of indigeneity, how indigeneity, especially in the case of Christian and Jews in the Arab world, come to be used against Muslim identities. No, we were here before. We're the true Egyptian. We're the Phoenicians, we're the Copts, we're the Assyrians, we're, and we're the Jews. I see it often in memoirs playing quite prominently as a way to suggest that, and I understand saying the context of ISIS attacking and writing the letter Nun, Nasrani, Nasara, Christians on the gates or doors of, I understand the clinging to that identity, when you're under attack and even genocidal practices, that you would want to claim that identity and even use it against the way ISIS used Islam. But is this the only way to speak about our Christian, Muslim, or Jewish identity? No, I hope that we can have not just this kind of religio-ethno-nationalist fixations that that become very problematic because they become exclusivist and mutually exclusive categories. So I believe as a multi-axis analysis, as a method, as an analytical method, because I do think that analytical method captures better the multitude of affiliations and identities. So that, of course, applies also to the question of the Arab Jew. I just want to say that the Arab Jew is not a special and unique identity. It only becomes problematic category, so-called, because of the because of the way Judaism can be formed as an ethno-national identity in contradistinction to Arab nationalism, which did not exactly happen in the same way with the emergence of Christian identity.
Yeah, that's No, I think but still, I think the Arab Jew, in a way, is also an anomaly as a term. Yeah. After listening to you, because we wouldn't, for example, I mean, in our daily encounters with colleagues and friends from, let's say, Middle Eastern countries, I mean, we usually don't care who's a Chaldean, who's a Druze, who's a Baha'i, who's a Shia, because it's other aspects of our lives and relations which stand in the foreground. So in a way, I think the Arab Jew is a subversive notion, but subversive to what? Is it? And it's probably to this historiography and conceptualization of polarity that is either a reaction to the Palestinian or Israeli context, or it's a part of, of the relations with Europe. On the other hand, I mean, one thing, I mean, I've been confronted with discussions about Arab Jewish, Muslim Jewish things very often for a long time. For example, we had a project on Jewish Islamic hermeneutics, which was very interesting, where the question of the politicization of religious identities was to be critically addressed by scholars from within these fields. But somehow, in those discussions, they always marginalized other groups. So the Christian, in a way, was always the European, because, and in that way, too, it mirrored this polarization of Islam and Europe. So the subversiveness of the term, of the notion of the Arab Jew, is somehow also related to its opposite, because it's an affirmation, because why can it be a Jew simply be an Arab?
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. It made me think, in an essay I wrote on I call it the rupture before the rupture. And I compared it to the imagery and representation of Christian in the Middle East in relation to Jews in the Middle East prior to the emergence of nationalism, really in the colonial context and imperial expanding influences, especially in the Ottoman Empire. And I thought it was at that point, at least I looked at various representations, including visual representations, let's say Delacroix imaging of massacre at Chios. Okay, this is really Ottomans, Turks as the evil against the Greeks, right? And I said at that point, the Jew was still allied in the imaginary of Europe with the Muslim. It is the local Christian minorities who were still the oppressed in need of rescue from the evil Muslim. So we still, in some ways, were living at that still 19th century moment, still the long millennia of the Christian-Muslim wars going back to the Crusaders. The Jews were still in that imaginary, the allies of the Muslim, as they have always been in that type of, and the Jew, and it's fascinating that with modernity, with emancipation of the Jews in Europe, with the emergence of the Haskalah and the new kind of Jew, the Mendelssohn, say, in the context of Germany, or the Crémier in the context of France, who export, as it were, emancipation ideas into the colonial context. And that's where I said the rupture before the rupture, in other words, the beginning of the separation of the Jew in the Middle East from the Muslim begins even prior to Zionism. And at that moment, in fact, the Jew comes to be as a minority, especially in the French context. It begins really with the colonization of Algeria and North Africa. The Jew now comes to be modeled on the way the Christian, the Assyrian, in need of rescue by the British, and the way that the colonial project, as everyone calls it, the divide and conquer project, where the Phoenician identity emerges as an ethno-nationalist in contradistinction to the Arabs, and the Assyrian emerges as the true, the Arab of Constance for the Muslims, etc. The Jew for a long time was not part of that missionary activity, but that missionary came to be embodied by the European Jew in relation to the local indigenous Jew. And I compare that type of activity. And Crémier, who also established the Alliance Française Israélite, the French educational civilization project, toward the natives, really extended the idea not only of emancipation, but also of the notion of the civilizing mission, but this time to their own brethren, the co-religionist Jews. Now, why is that important to us? Because I say, even if there were no, Arab and Jewish nationalism, we would still be facing, look at the 19th century, that type of imperialist way of recruiting the minorities, in this case, the Christian minorities first, but then with the transformation of European Jews, the German, the British, the French, into part of the receiving citizenship was also meant, and they believing in that project, right? Mm-hmm. So now you have a whole category, including in visuals, where now the local Jew is the victim of the Muslim, right? The way that we see Massacre in Chios by Delacroix, we see the Odenk imaging the execution of Selika that happened a few decades earlier, a Moroccan Jew executed. It was a whole complicated story. I won't go into the detail right now, but it became a symbol of, she was called Jeanne d'Arc, the Jewish Jeanne d'Arc. So that type of, and I'm only using it as a metaphor for the fact that the narratives of rescue now in relation to minorities, and even the category as we know as minorities, emerges in that colonial context. One is the idea of egalitarianism, but that egalitarianism somehow always went against the Muslims, right? So I'm not saying that we were equal exactly in status, Jews or Christian, as Ahl al-Kitab, but still, the way that that type of oppression was portrayed as engendered type of categories, and always somehow the imperial forces had to rescue us, was now something very new. And therefore I'm saying what I call the rupture before the rupture emerges as a way of a part of the divide and conquer landscape that shifted. And with the education of, in this case, of Jews to become French, learn French, abandon Arabic. I'm actually focusing a lot about right now in my work with the idea of the Judeo-Arabic language as a category, about those moments of shifts that take place even prior to the emergence of the modernization of Hebrew, etc. But I think this formation of elites, which happened throughout the colonial world everywhere, it happened in India, it happens in Egypt, suddenly French becomes a language of the elite, to the point that Arabic becomes part of class stratification. And then you have, of course, the nationalist response and re-Arabization sometimes in brutal ways against, Amazigh, Berber, or on the one, for example, in the context of North Africa. Which now there is an attempt to rewrite and revisit that history. So you're right that the Arab Jew came to form kind of an anomaly vis-a-vis in the diaspora context, that in a way that you don't think when you say Arab Christian in the same way. But I'm trying to suggest that that is circumscribed, that is part of a new kind of situation, that yes, Palestine is an important element in that, because I began that some of my work by the question, there wouldn't be the question of the Arab Jew if there wasn't the question of the Jew in Europe, the Jewish question in Europe, if there weren't the question of the Arab or the question of Palestine. We're kind of a collateral damage in a series of questions. And right now you're absolutely right, but to understand how it's we cannot naturalize that history. We have to interrogate it, and that's, I think, what the Arab category also serves. For me, it's not just about a descriptive category, it's also an analytical category that allows us to go against the grain. You can call it subversive, as you did before, but it's really about interrogation and examination of what and that's our role as intellectual, never to take for granted the categories that are handed to us, I hope.
Thank you. I also don't like this category minority. I mean, in one of your recent articles, you wrote about this year of the fall of the citizenship, like 70 years of the experience of Jews from Iraq.
Sent at the state, yeah.
And I mean, one part of that article was also dealing with the question of the pogromization or Farhudization of Jewish history, of the history of Jews from Arab lands. So this brings me also to this question. I mean, it relates perhaps to like attempts to integrate the history of the Jews of the East into the narrative of the Jews of Europe. Mm-hmm. So you see it as narratives of persecution and pogroms, and thus unify or integrate them in one notion of Jewish history.
Yeah.
But it also, I think, is part of of a tendency of many groups to define themselves in terms of painful pasts that are commemorated, and they become constitutive for the community. So what's your argument, like, with or against the programmization of the experiences of the Arab Jews? And maybe as a second part of the question, I mean, I don't also like the idea of minorities, because somehow also doesn't address maybe it's not only contemporary, but I mean, you could say that in today's world, even the majorities are minorities. So you have internal forms of oppression, where the masters of oppression are natives themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is also the reason, I mean, we discussed this a bit in this workshop on the possibilities of Arab Jewish thought in relation to Najat Abdelhaq's presentation on the contemporary novels in Arabic that address the lives of Jews. And I think, for example, you have also lots of novels that not only treat Jewish characters as the main figures, but also Kurdish or Armenians or all sorts of other characters. So I think it must relate to the tasqid of the rights and aspirations of many people. So in that way, I think it's almost it connects the experience of the Arab Jews to the to the experiences of other people and to the experiences of the majority. So that is why perhaps that's perhaps how the idea of the Arab Jew also changes meaning now in our time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think maybe I will begin touching the last point that you made. I'll start with that because you had many levels, many aspects to your comment, your question. In 2013, my friend Michael Rakowitz, the artist, and Regine Basha, a curator, we worked together on a project called Dar al-Sulh, which Michael initiated, which was basically part of a cooking Iraqi food. It emerged out of the American context of American soldiers coming back from Iraq, but knowing nothing about Iraq. And because he's of Iraqi Jewish background, he thought that would be a way of bringing about a multi-level conversation. And that project actually ended up, Dubai Art Festival invited it, and we ended up cooking in Dubai a whole week and using that as a platform to speak about the absent, he called it the absent tribe, or I called it culinary ghosting. In my work, in terms of the idea that through food we can perhaps, and as you know, the Gulf has many exilic Arabs, including Iraqis, and it was an extremely touching event in the sense that through our old pain, as it were, because we were mostly dislocated in the early 50s, more recently exiled Arabs from Lebanon, Egypt, Palestine, Iraq especially, could speak about their own pain, trauma, and disaster. So I think when I completely related to what you were saying, that this is now the pain of the majority. It is the experience of the majority, the question of oppression and violence. And while each experience, of course, has its own context and specificities, there is a level in which the way not only colonialism and imperialism, etc., but also Arab dictatorships have produced incredible violence. And in the case of Iraq, Arabization came to be so associated with the violence, and that people also don't want to be called Arabs, and for good reasons. Mm. So, even the term Arab has resonated very differently in different contexts with negative or positive association, depending how we articulate it. So in that tent, as it were, which allowed so many diasporic Arabs to come together and speak about those experiences, we realized, one has to speak about almost the history of the Middle East as an exilic history, because even intellectually, actually, Sinan and I taught almost 10 years ago a course on Iraq here at NYU, a seminar. And we felt that, we cannot teach Iraqi culture without speaking about exile, because the intellectual interventions of writers and artists took also place in exile, be it in the Arab world, say in Beirut, or be it in London or in San Diego. So all of that, I think is true generally for the Arab world, whether it's diaspora because of economic reasons or because of political violence. So I think that allowed, and you mentioned Najat's work and also Sinan's in his novel, Ya Maryam, it's really about how the violence toward Christian in the context of contemporary Iraq throw the character into a flashback, thinking about, was that what the Jews were experiencing at that moment? So it creates a kind of a haunting experience, as a kind of dialogue between the past and the present. And I think that allowed, in a sense, for a better understanding of something that you cannot just dismiss, as often was the case. God forbid you say the word Yehudi below al-Arabiya. If you say, post-Palestine, it immediately, it's Adu al-Sayuni, the Zionist enemy. I think that discourse, in a sense, has gradually shifted, at least to allow for the, Arab Jewish voices to be heard in the Arab context. I mean, by the way, that was part of the project that in the 90s, this was originally a German-speaking film, Samir. Jamal ad-Din made the film Forget Baghdad. And when he was trying, I was the advisor originally to the film, when he was trying to raise funds, nobody wanted even to help him because from all level, it was a suspicious project. Why someone who's not Jewish would want to make a film about Iraqi Jews? So, but then I think the film intervened in the public sphere in terms of transforming our understanding by giving space and voice for Iraqi Jews to speak for themselves, but in dialogue with, say, in this case, Iraqi Muslim Christian, right? Or background, that is. Okay, the other point that you made with regards to, actually, before I go to the Farhudization, programmization, there is another point that is related to Arab and the diaspora, because we spoke about it as a term that emerges partially in the diaspora for a good reason, but it has a long history. In fact, some historians, like Peter Webb, argue that actually the term Arab did not exist. Various pre-Islamic historians of pre-Islamic Arab Peninsula argue that the term Arab did not exist at that time in the Arab Peninsula, that the names were tribal, according to your tribal affiliation, that only with Islam actually, and the dislocation or the expansion or opening, whatever term one wants to use, conquest, colonization now even is a term that is used for that, that the term Arab emerges in that context. It's interesting, and this is actually what I'm writing about these days, that I'm interested in the way that the term Arabization today applies in some of the writing by, it started actually with some of the German Jews, like Goiten and Blau, people who at least not German Jews, or at least had German education in Vienna, Berlin, etc., Frankfurt, who started, and they formed in Jerusalem, and our friend Nono wrote a lot about the German Orientalist in Israel, and Amnon Ras-Prakotskin, I should say. And in fact, that school of thought had incredible influence in the way categories today about Arab Jews are being understood. And one of my critique right now that I'm working on is how the term Arabization at that historical moment of the 7th century, arrival to Iraq, say the translation of Saadia Gaon, who translated the Bible into Arabic, etc., is understood as a way of surviving or assimilating into Arab culture. And that therefore Arabization was an artificial thing that now, with the return to Zion, the return to Hebrew, we can get rid of that millennia external irrelevant thing called the Arab and Arabization, and in fact, Goiten's Jews and Arabs for me represent that, his book, Jews and Arab. I wrote now 50-page detailed analysis of this book. So, so I'm saying Arabization and being an Arab, or it's not necessarily new. It's just that in the 20th century, it received a particular meaning that has to do with the emergence of new categories called ethno-nationalism. So that's one. So now we'll come back to your other important question, which is pogromization, Farhudization. Why am I using this? I think often when people caricature one's work, and I'm afraid that my work has often been subjected to caricature, and I see it as part of this political vilification. Stuff I never even recognized that I said. I said, did I say that? And then I have to go and check my writing, and I said, oh my God, because I would never put stuff in that type of hopefully crude way or reductionist way, I hope. That I'm being said as if we were never persecuted, that I'm idealizing somehow the history of Jews in Islam. And in fact, I have even a phrase like, even in my old work of the 80s, the most politicized writing that I did in the 80s, I say, however, we should not idealize the situation of Jews within Islam. And I say that after the paragraph where I say that Eurocentric historiographical norms have subjected Jews within Islam into, projected onto them the experiences of Jews in Europe. Hence, pogromization, not because Jews had wonderful time or Christian, etc. I don't want to idealize that situation, even though historians such as, for example, various historians who compared, Maxime Rodinson, for example, argued that we cannot, that the story of Jews within Islam is very different than that within Europe, that they were not subjected to that type of persecution, but we cannot, I think there is an agreement, we cannot idealize that given the religious hierarchies that existed and the notion of religious superiority, but that does not mean persecution to that, the way that the pogrom has come to, as a European term, come to be projected to the situation of Jews within Islam. And in this particular point within Iraqi history, it's the moment of the Farhud, 1941. Yes, it was horrible. I have relatives who were killed. I have my traumas. It's not that I'm trying to deny those traumas. It's not that I'm trying to deny what happened, but I also try to contextualize it and also see it, one, within a historical context, B, to see it as part of the context of World War I, Axis allies. This is not to defend anything that was done or how the masses, as we know, were sent out to kill. And also to remind that that was not necessarily a general policy, that Jewish neighbors, for example, saved my father too. So there are all of those elements, just as we were attacking my mother's family, my family. So Farhudization as a concept, or pogromization, that I try is to call attention to the fact that there is a reductivist element that now wants to see everything that happened to Jews within Islam. We have selective moments, only of the moments of persecution. So you're right that it is important for creating kind of a cohesive sense of identity, the persecuted minority. But that's what I'm trying to resist, because I just feel like it doesn't capture, in any community, it doesn't capture its complex cultural formation, identity, affiliation. It produces narratives of victimization that are can only serve a way in which, I believe, Mizrahis especially live in kind of, I called it a schizophrenic existence for a long time, in a way that in order to be able to assert your Jewish identity and even Israeli identity, it can only happen by, and even if you claim your Mizrahiness, Arabness, it can only be articulated in the form of your being a victim of Arab Muslims. But that's not the full complexity of the history,
I saw also an interesting, like next week there will be a nice discussion too, another one in Egypt in Arabic by, I think it's organized by the party Bread and Freedom, also a nice historical name. It will be a conversation with 5 persons. All of them are children or grandchildren of Egyptian communists. Like, okay, one, I think maybe one is the daughter of Shohat Harun. I think her name is Magda.
Magda.
And the daughter of Yusuf Derwish and the daughter of Marie Rosenthal and of Ahmed Sadiq Saad. Like, which is interesting is it's an event that is organized to commemorate Albert Ariel, who recently passed away, also a Jewish communist. It's entitled "I Chose to Remain."
It's entitled what? Sorry, I didn't hear.
I chose to remain. I find it an interesting.
I chose to remain. I know, yeah.
An interesting analogy to Ghassan Kanafani or to
Emil Habibi, actually, on his on his grave, yeah.
And it's interesting in the short CVs or the introductions of the speakers. Each person is introduced as the son or granddaughter of Al-Munadil so and so. I find it a very interesting evocation of the political and cultural history of Jews who played an important role for progressive movements in a country like Egypt. So it's an interesting way also to relate, in that case, Egyptian Jews to the ongoing struggles of the country. So memory is linked to political aspirations and to rereadings of history in a larger term, which is not minoritarian, I think. No? It's
yeah. No, it's fascinating. Well, I know Magda. In fact, she was in this very room when she said, "I want, God forbid, on my stone, I chose to remain," you know, which is very touching and very moving.
So this brings me maybe, and then we can ask, I don't know if there are questions, to this question of what does, for you, Arab Jew mean today?
Yeah, wow. So I think I'm very touched by Magda and people like Magda because they chose the category of being a Jew in an Arab world and claiming their Arabness as well, and also choosing not to leave. And that hasn't been easy. I mean, there are many people who did not want to leave. And that's when you mentioned Standard Tasreit, in that essay, I tried, at least in the Iraqi context, to show how complicated it was. You know, this idea that everyone wanted to leave, etc. And that's why I say that in the Arab Jewish context, it's true that people were forced to leave, especially in the case of Egypt, for example, etc. And we can use the term refugee, but it's sometimes more complicated than the Palestinian, at least, case in terms of how we describe desire and will to remain or to go, because of the multiple forces, say, of Jewish nationalism and Zionism and the notion of exile and return on the one hand, etc. But in this case, I think you can see also in the French context, I've noticed some Jews who choose to return to Morocco, Tunisia. It's not necessarily, or at least to be in between. I think in the case, it's fascinating to me that a lot of the memoirs, whether people live there or decide to return as visits, it becomes an important aspect of reclaiming. So I call it the imaginary of return, because it's not always about literally returning, given the complications, the material, political complications. But for people who never left, like Magda, the notion of staying becomes part of a symbolic statement, but also part of a project of rehabilitation. I think the debates over the site, that's almost a conversation in itself, cemeteries, synagogues, as the remains, the archive, various archives, say the Iraqi archive, they're all like part of that symbolic battle of who possessed that history, who owns that history, who has a right to claim it. But for people who do stay there, it becomes part of that struggle of reclaiming, not only vis-a-vis kind of a refusal of the idea that Jews had to leave the Arab world, but also vis-a-vis Arab nationalism, reductionist forms of Arab nationalism that now portrayed all Jews as the enemies. And by doing so, ironically, made Jews leave, creating an atmosphere of hostility where every Jew was Jesus, a spy, etc. So I think we have kind of a new moment on one level, a kind of a dynamic of, shall we call it, opening of the debate, which we touched on a little bit before, of thinking what does it mean to be an Arab Jew in that context. So I think for today, as we think about this issue, it's more than just, and I think it comes back to the idea of diasporas, because we started with communication technologies. It's no longer that isolated existence. As we said, people are meeting each other. The various Middle Eastern diasporas who left for different reasons, different communities. There is an ongoing conversation. Facebooks, YouTube, you have ongoing conversation, battles, disagreements, hatred, but you also have affinities and efforts to be empathetic and understand. And I think at least it is not as rigid as it used to be in that way. So, but I think for Palestinians, it becomes an issue, right? Because how do you claim the Arab Jew? Because there are many ways of claiming the Arab Jew. And I think sort of like someone like Magda and, coming of the communist background, etc., they're trying to claim it in a way that is also supportive of Palestinians. Because often you have to choose, and that's really part of the problem. It's almost like you either choose to say Arab Jews or Jews in Arab lands were victims, and that justifies what happened to Palestinians, or that evens out, the two exoduses. On the other hand, you have other arguments. And I think by choosing to stay, I chose to remain. That statement is also to suggest, no, I didn't have to leave, or I didn't want to leave. Even if I was forced to leave by all those ideological forces, I nonetheless remained. And I do not choose for my inheritance and history in Egypt, in this case, to be used against other people. So I think it creates a little bit of a different dynamic, at least in the public sphere. But I think that today, at least, the whole idea of what it means to return becomes a very complicated question. Who's returning, where, and what, and to what? It sort of like goes back, in the 70s when Albert Memmi wrote against the idea of the Arab Jew, because when at that point Gaddafi was calling Jews to return, there were all this term by diverse Arab nationalists call to return. But of course, the very circumstances that forced people to leave were still there. But what does it mean after the Arab Spring or the Arab winter? Etc., to call to return. It's not a history of one has to acknowledge that it's never about return, going back by a kind of, those can be very dangerous ideas necessarily of going back to the roots. There is always kind of a purist idea, which I think what ethno-nationalism in general, and you can see that I have a hard time with ethno-nationalist ideas, precisely because they're based on this cohesive notion of the nation that ends up repressing and muffling a lot of the complex voices.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe are there any questions in the chat room or?
Thank you very much for the very, very interesting talk. As I checked, there was no questions from the audience till now, but I have a question actually, because Ella, you mentioned the idea that the de-Arabization process and so in Israel and the dangerous idea of these Arab Jews that comes to Israel, immigrated from the Arab states or Islam states, and we know that one of the ideas that us as co-creators in the Middle East Union, we think about solidarity as an idea to go over not all over national borders, but also inside of national borders to create this new thinking that is not abide to national borders, as it was maybe 100 years ago in the Ottoman Empire. And my question is what is the dangerous idea that still maybe haunts Israel in this idea of solidarity of the Arab Jews with Palestinians? Because you were an activist that, one of the first activists also as a scholar, but also as a Mizrahi activist that broke the border between and you went to met with the PLO and in the Toledo conference and in other venues and did this solidarity, radical solidarity with the Palestinians. Also, your thinking with your book, for instance, about Israeli cinema from '48. You wrote both about the narrative of the Mizrahi and the Palestinians to deconstruct the terms of Israeli cinema, and also in your outstanding breaking article about the narrative of the Mizrahi, which was the Zionists from the Jewish victims as a allusion to Edward Said, the Zionism from his Palestinian victims. And so my question is that today they're still using, for instance, the idea of the lost property that Danny Danon just a few years ago on the stage of the UN, he talked about, I have the quote here, he says, we don't hear the international community speak of them, I mean the Arab Jews, when they discuss the refugee conflict. Perhaps it's because they don't serve the Palestinian narrative, and they took this money, the claim for the money of the Arab Jews, the Israeli government, in order to abide or to dispossess the idea of, they said, first give back the property to the Arab Jews, and then we will give the compensation to the Palestinian refugees and so on. But I don't want to talk about the politic idea, but more to ask you, what is this dangerous idea that the regime is so afraid from this notion of solidarity between Arab Jews and Palestinians, and so they're doing all the time new ideas to divide and rule.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mati. This is the history of trying to speak beyond ethno-nationalism for intellectual, I don't think was always easy. It depends in any context. So I will begin with one point that you mentioned, which is the Ottomans before the borders, because I think that's fascinating for us, because we want to think about that history. And of course, over the past decade or more, actually, there has been, of course, as we know in the Arab world, a certain kind of nostalgia to the Ottoman Empire, which partially has to do with the disappointment or the disillusionment with a certain kind of Arab nationalism, nation-state borders, conflicts, the disasters, the massive exoduses, violence. And you can understand that at that point, we didn't have to have passport. We didn't have to have checkpoints. We could move from Jerusalem to Baghdad, Cairo, etc. Take a train or take a car or before that, ride a horse. And, so there is naturally this notion of flags and passports and borders are oppressive, but they're oppressive everywhere to my mind, because with the emergence of nationalism and nation states, this is, one of the, but of course one can say nationalism emerges as a response to certain kind of imperial or empires and their oppressions. So nostalgia can have a function in a context of deprivation. They feel a kind of a hole precisely because of something that is missing or the oppressive element that we try to transcend. But sometimes nostalgias can also be very dangerous ideas because they lull us to think or delude us to think that suddenly everything was okay under the Ottoman Empire. So of course, we wouldn't have all those rebellions within the Ottoman Empire if everything was so great, right? So I think, we always speak within the context in which we are, and how we read history is connected to that. But the Ottoman Empire, of course, sheds light on one level on the way that nationalism emerged in the region in ways that ended up not necessarily as just liberatories, but also with their oppressive consequences. In the case of Israel-Palestine, as we know, which also took place under British colonialism, it's really hard to speak about the history of the Arab Jew only from the position of Europe. And I think by shifting the perspective, and you're saying why it's dangerous, I really think it's apart from property, etc. I'm not going to speak about that kind of just materialist elements of because I think there have symbolic value in those discussions, and it is also about what type of affinity, affiliation, identifications are being created. And I think the idea of transcending ethno-nationalist ideas by having empathy, identification with kind of a cross-religious, cross-community is always something that when you have conflict, it is being used, and here the question of Mizrahim claim their Arabness or their Middle Easterners, unfortunately is perceived as a threat to Euro-Israeli identity, precisely because it allied itself from its foundation with a certain idea of the West. I mean, a certain vision of the West that goes back, as we know, to as I said, to the ideas of emancipation and assimilation within Europe. So there is an investment in that idea that goes back to the beginning of the formation of Zionism. What often, and I was working, for example, on Goitem, who's an Arabist, who specializes in the history of Jews and Islam, who researched the Gniza so well and supplied us with document about the complex and, you can call it now coexistence, his idea of the symbiosis. And yet in that book, he can write at the very end of the book, without hesitation that, now that Jews from Arab countries are offered modernity in Europe, of course they will take Europe and modernity, because that is now the better option. I'm not putting it in a vulgar way, but that's really the summary of the argument. And so there is a question of cultural formation, identification, but politically it sort of like changes the map. I mean, I'm speaking about, political solution can always be created. I mean, if there is a will, but I think for a political solution to happen, definitions, identities, and how we understand the relationship between communities have to be reformed and transcended. And probably the notion of the Arab Jew in that sense intervene or in that idea, not because it's about it's about because it shifts the way we think about Israel-Palestine. through the critical prism, I mean, not just when we celebrate the folkloric idea of Oriental Jews, right? But really to think that people could live, and that's really a way of some historians say about even the Ottoman Empire, the complexity of the Ottoman Empire in Palestine, the way various communities live together.
Last 2 minutes.
Of course, tensions and conflict happen, but that was part of it. So when it comes to the property, I really think that, again, it's not a new idea. In fact, already in the 50s, you have the population exchange idea, right? Refugees, Palestinian refugees, Jews, refugees from Arab lands, that equals out. Later came the idea of the property. So it worries me the way our history and traumatic history is being simply told as a story of refugees simply against the Palestinian. Why can't we tell a complex story that brings on board all of those traumas, including the European Jewish experience, which needs to be talked about, but not in the way that it is constantly being superimposed on the Middle East.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Georges Khalil, Professor Ella Shohat.
Oh yeah, it's finished. I have one last question, so it's a short one.
Okay, the last short question.
Yeah, it's also a big question. Maybe it relates to this idea of the Palestinian Jew. I mean, before the creation of the State of Israel, I think there was this category. It was this description of the Palestinian Jew. So if one follows, for example, the writings of, or some of the ideas of our friend Amnon Ras-Krakowski about this theological reading, this Protestant theological reading of the history of the Bible into the history of the land, and that Palestine is the secular of the State of Israel, and this idea for the future that that land is not for domination, but it's to be shared, and this question when the Jews can become children of the land. If they become children of the land, then they will be Palestinian Jews, perhaps. And I find it also interesting that links a bit to this diasporic notion, because in the recent, disturbing events in Palestine, I mean, some of our Palestinian friends also somehow emphasized this moment that the Palestinians also within the State of Israel reclaim their Palestinianness. And they are described by the State of Israel as Arabs of Israel, but they reclaim their Palestinianness across the divisions of their land, of their homeland. So it's an interesting question of how does the idea of the Palestinian Jew relate to the Arab Jew? But it's maybe a topic of another discussion.
Yeah, completely. It's like we need now another hour, but I think it's a very important point to raise. And, it really raises a question about what is indigenous, because after all, how do we talk about the Palestinian Jew in a particular context, but also the fact that Palestinians have been denied even the right to use the term Palestinians, right? In the context of Israel, as you mentioned, Arab Israeli has been the official category, while for Arab Jews, we cannot use the term Arab, right? So in the very same place, Arabic-speaking Jews and Palestinian who encountered each other, say Iraqi Jews and Palestinian in the 50s, talking to each other in Arabic. It's fascinating which term can be used by whom at what point. And I come back to the phrase, the denial of subjectivity, because you have to conform to particular hegemonic definitions which ally themselves with the power. So for Palestinian, the term Palestine is the denied one, So today, sort of the neutral term, Palestinian citizens of Israel as a descriptive term, but also a term of affiliation and identity, how Palestinians within Israel feel. But officially, they are defined the same thing with Arab Jews. Arab Jews are not defined as Arab, they're Jews as a national and religious identity. So we come back to the point of I called it the anomalies of the national and the colonial in the case of Zionism. Why? Because there is always an emphasis of the idea that unlike other religions, Christianity or Islam, Judaism is also an ethno-national identity. Well, one can argue about that, right? And it goes back also to Mati's earlier question. But in the case of the claiming of the Arab Jew, even as a cultural practice, that was seen as a problematic category. But what's fascinating, now we come back to those terms, Iraqi is fine, Egyptian is fine within the Israeli context, because then you're speaking about coming from a country, right? And that actually affects, I'll give you another example, language, it's not, although in the 50s and 60s, there was a suppression, even kind of a policing of speaking Arabic in the public sphere for Jews, right? Palestinians lived in their own segregated spaces. So but in the mixed Jewish spaces, that was a taboo, right? But what's fascinating is that today, as the reclaiming of that past is undergoing a certain kind of renaissance, it's not Arabic that is being reclaimed. There is a conception in which we spoke somehow a different language than Arabic, and it is called Iraqi language. It's called Egyptian language. It's called Moroccan language. To that level, so while, say, critical intellectuals like ourselves are trying to reclaim the Arabness for various reasons, one as a descriptive category, but also as an analytical and also as a, conceptual political category. Others, in the case of Palestine, the Arabness has been a way of suppressing their Palestinianness. And I think, George, in a sense, what you touch on is really fundamental to our discussion here. The way identities they're not only not fixed, they're categories that are constructed. That doesn't mean that they don't have reverberation in the world, but they're constructed in a way that ultimately the way we constructed and think about them, if we want to undo oppression, we have to constantly engage in the terminology. And that's really where the term like Arab Jew or Palestinian come into this debate.
Thank you very much, Ella. I'm sorry that we have to cut it now, but we have to go for the next panel soon. I would like to thank you very much for this fruitful, enriching conversation, and I learned, and I'm sure that our audience also learned a lot. Thank you, Professor Ella Shohat from New York. Thank you, Georges Khalil from Berlin. And we'll make a short pause, and on 4 o'clock we will have the new panel about the environmental measures in the Middle East Union. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Come, imagine with us.